we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's Ryan Martin here. I'm taking over this webinar this month. Adam has decided to have a rostered day off. It's actually somewhere within arm's reach, actually, but we'll get it started to this afternoon. The idea this month is that we're really going to have a good look at high expectations in our classroom and in our schools. And I'm going to apologise early because there's a real sport theme that permeates right through this webinar today. Now, I'm not the same sort of sport tragic that Adam is, but I do love my sport, and so many of the analogies that I'll share with you this afternoon come from sport. So if sport's not your thing, I'm sure that you'll be able to draw some similar examples from things that you would find may line up quite closely with them. So what I would suggest, if you've got a little bit of time, go and grab your tracksuit pants and runners, get a couple of sweatbands, and we'll delve into this in a very sporty and active way this afternoon. Now, the picture that I've put up the front this afternoon is one of the marathon. Now, if you're living in Melbourne, you'd be really aware that once football season finishes, we get a bit lost in Victoria, and so we've put a marathon on. One of the most boring sports to watch, but there's certainly, I suppose, some close similarities that we can draw from marathons around the expectations that those competitors will set when they get on that start line this Sunday. Now, I have attempted to run a marathon. Now, I did finish it, but it was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life, and my wife had to pat my head and walk with me most of the last 10 kilometres. And part of that was because I had not prepared or probably set some expectations around what I was actually capable of, given the amount of training that I actually put in. Now, there'll be some people at this start line who will just be on the start line and they'll be just hoping to crawl home, and there will be some others that have incredibly high expectations because of the preparation that they've put into their training, that will have times and splits, and they'll have all sorts of things arranged along the way to support them to get to the finish line in a targeted time that they might have. Interestingly enough, my beautiful wife trained for a marathon a couple of years ago. I don't know why she did it after she saw how difficult it was for me, but her preparation was in complete contrast to mine, and so was the outcome. At the start of the year, she set a target to do it. She did all her training for the Melbourne Marathon in Darwin, so obviously incredibly difficult with the heat and the humidity, but she set about a program and her expectations around what she would be able to deliver around a really clear, structured program, and made sure that she had a support of another training partner. When she got to the start line at Melbourne in October, she was incredibly well prepared. She was realistic about what she could do, and by no means had bitten off more than she could chew. And in contrast, my preparation was, well, look, typically quite blokey. I just decided, yeah, I'm fit, I can do it. I'll do some long runs, and off I go. And the two results were very, very different. Now, I think when we look at these, this is an example, I think it gets really close to when we talk about that establishment phase at the start of the year. And that it seems to be that we talk about the establishment phase and the expectations that we set for our classrooms is something that we do at the start of the year. Now, it doesn't have to be at the start of the year, and we can pick off other parts of the year, but we need to make sure that when we establish a new expectation, that we put the time in and we put some thought into what will happen if things fall apart a little bit, if the wheels come off. What are the types of, I suppose, strategies that we could use to make sure that we can pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and stick the course rather than giving up and going for something that might be a little bit easier. And if we build our expectations in a measured way and make sure that they're realistic, they've got a much greater chance of being successful. So we look at those a first marathon is met with some expectations, but they're pretty simple, and it's about getting the job done based on preparation. And if you choose to go again, you build on that, and you aim for a better performance because you're able to raise the expectation. And I think the expectations in schools can be built upon in the same way. A school that I was the principal at a couple of years ago, when I got there, I was really keen to make sure that our students were wearing their uniform. But I suppose I have to be a little bit realistic because the kids actually didn't come to school in shoes. So one way of working on that hopefully the plan or the targeted plan to get them all in uniform was the idea that let's just start with shoes. We'll work on shoes, and then once we get that, we'll throw something else into the mix. And it's certainly the way that we can operate in classrooms. We can look at an idea of, well, we won't get all the way straight away, but we can work on a path that gets us there, maybe without causing us a huge amount of grief as we go. Now, I think the educational link is really looking at applying expectations or high expectations to whatever the base is that students arrive with you at. So in some schools it would be really easy to make sure that uniform is an expectation, and that could involve ties, blazers, long socks, polished shoes. And the other one is that it might just be, in my experience, or as my example shows, that we just get them in shoes. And we've got to look at where our expectations start from and what's the base when we do that. And certainly there's certainly some challenges that we can face as we go through, but we've got to make sure that the expectation that we set we're really comfortable with, and we know that we can, I suppose, stay the course. So today, look, I'm not sure this was the greatest picture, because when you look really closely at this picture, if you have a good look at your screens, I'm pretty sure that these guys have just been stuck into this picture. It's not the genuine article, I don't think. But look, the reason why I put it there is the idea is that this afternoon we're going to cover a little bit of ground, and it might feel like we're sort of pushing uphill a little bit with some of it. But the important thing to note is with this webinar is that it is being recorded, and you can go back to this at any time through the Real Schools website and check in if there's something that you missed, or maybe you want to clarify something because you're a little unsure. You certainly can go back via the website. Again, it is a really terrible picture, but I think it's important to note that sometimes, and I think it helps with this, is that expectations can certainly feel like we're working uphill a little bit, and it's nice to have people help us along the way. Hopefully maybe it's not as cheesy as this picture might indicate, but certainly our challenges are always much easier if we do it as a collective and we work together when we're setting those expectations. So this is your race. I really would encourage you through the dashboard, through this webinar, to ask some questions. You're in control. If you have any questions, please ask. I'm going to keep an eye out for those questions. And interestingly enough, not many ask questions, and so we would really like you to put your hand up if you've got something to add. It always makes it a little bit more interactive. But behind the scenes, Chris is checking to see if there is anyone that's having any problems with sound or picture. If you can just click on your question box, let Chris know what that problem is, and behind the scenes she'll look after you and make sure that we get that fixed up for you, so that this is a good experience for you rather than one that's frustrating and then you have to opt out. Yeah, and again, if you've got a question, you'll see on that dashboard that there is a hand, and so you certainly can put your hand up, and we'd really like to hear from you along the way if you've got something to add to this webinar. So this is, I suppose, a starting point. I have a question. I've got a couple of questions that I want to sort of run through. So it kind of gives me a bit of an idea of the audience that I have in attendance today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to launch this question, and I'd like you to answer. I'll give you about a minute to answer it. So hang on, we'll just get to that poll. Okay, so I'm going to launch that poll. If you could just click on what probably for the group, you may be with the group, but if the group's mainly teachers, click on teachers. If you've got some support staff, or it's mainly just you're a leader, please just indicate who we're dealing with today. It always helps to make sure that we hit the target market. I certainly wouldn't want to be going down the webinar and missing the people that we have in the audience. So it looks like we are, we're pretty good to go. So I'm just going to close this poll, share the results. Well, we are pretty strong today with teachers, which is great. So, and I suppose the really important part is that certainly that's the target that we're aiming to support here today. So I'm just going to shut this poll down and go back to our slides. All right, we're good to go. Okay, so that's our starting point. Now, I'd like to ask two questions because it's good to know that we've got a majority of teachers with us today. But I've got one more, and I'm really interested here to look at your biggest challenge. Now, I thought this was quite kind of an apt one. Again, I'm so sorry. I've got stuck into the sport pictures as much as I can. This is kind of really close to what I looked like when I finished the marathon. I'd say at that stage my wife had walked quite a distance away because she was probably quite embarrassed by the fact that I was on the ground in complete exhaustion. But so we're going to just go to another poll question. And I'll launch this poll. So again, if you could just indicate along this. So we're looking at what are the greatest challenges to high expectations at your school? And when I have a good think about this, for me, it really does feel this idea that it's the consistency, that we have a real struggle with consistency when we apply an expectation, because it might not be a consistent approach across the school. You've got a raft of different ideas about what is going to work, and maybe we don't have that collective agreement across the school. The other one is around clear communication, that when we put an expectation in place, often it's not communicated clearly and it gets lost in translation. We have parents that are unsure of why this is happening, or other staff or your students in your classroom. The other one can be student behaviour, because often when we put an expectation in place, we get some pushback, and that pushback can be, it can certainly be challenging for us, that kids are saying, nah, we don't like it. And I think it's really important at this stage that we are really strong around the expectation that might be put in place, and that we stick the course and we continue to be clear about why we're doing it, and clearly, I suppose, implementing that. The other one is around that collective staff support and making sure that as a group of staff that we do it together, and we're much more powerful when we work together, and we can, and those expectations sit much more strongly when we're doing it together. One in, all in, it always seems to be a much better way to approach this type of stuff. And when things don't go right, we have staff that we can fall back on and ask questions, see what they're doing, observe what they're doing, and share that, and share those skills. And the other one is obviously parent support, and we're all really aware of parents, and when something's not well communicated or they're not particularly happy about it, parents can have a huge input into whether something's successful or not. If it's something a school or you really believe in your classroom, it's really important that you continue to clearly talk with parents, be really visible, and make sure that communication is open and honest so they understand where you're coming from. So look, I'm going to close that poll, and I'll share some results so you can have a look. But look, no shocks there with the idea that consistency is a huge challenge, and that idea, I suppose, that if we're not consistent, that it makes it very hard for people to understand why things are happening, and I suppose that that expectation stays within, before we put it aside. And the other one, obviously, student behaviour and that collective staff support. And certainly I'll talk to those things this afternoon. All right, I'll hide results and open up my screen again, and we'll continue moving on. So I thought this was kind of interesting. When we look at an important frame through which I want you to view your engagement today, is the reason that most schools struggle to establish and then sustain high expectations. It can be hard. There's no doubt it can be hard work, and it's easy to go back to what you know because it's comfortable. And a classic example, one of the schools that Real Schools partners with decided they had massive issues with litter in the school, and so they decided that, a little bit different to what schools would do with their breaks, that they would have lunchtime, or lunchtime would normally happen, but the kids would eat at the end of lunch. Now, it's a little bit different, but the first day that they ran this, there were so many kids that they found out didn't have lunch that they had to make 65 lunches for kids in the school, because all of these, they finally discovered that a whole lot of kids didn't have any lunch. Now, they could have easily gone, hang on, we can't do 65 lunches each day. This is going to be ridiculous. But they stuck the course and they decided, hang on, we're going to do this. What was some benefit? What did we see that worked really well here? There was no litter. The kids came back quite quickly from play because they wanted to make sure that they ate. And then they started to understand that, well, then there might be something else that they can look at, and that was the kids weren't getting to eat. So they were able to quickly address that, and that 65 quickly turned to a handful of kids each day, and it was very manageable. But the expectation they put in place, they were really determined about, and I've seen it in progress, and it works really, really well in the school. But that's because they were determined and they didn't wave the white flag because it got a little bit difficult. And I think when we push to drive high expectations in schools, it almost always results in some or all of the staff going, hang on, lots of questions here, this is pretty hard, but what do we want to stand for, and are we prepared to ride the certain ups and downs as that expectation is embedded as part of the school or classroom culture? I think that's really important. And in the October resources that I wrote, I referred to the successful football teams and the way that they've developed a culture of high expectations. Were there some people that got left behind? Yeah, there were, no doubt. But the culture developed over time was much stronger than the individuals that were pushing back, and they could be individuals on your staff, and they certainly can be individuals in your classroom that are going, actually, no, we don't like this. It's this idea that we continue to be quite determined. It's not, this is being really determined and being really clear about why we're doing certain things. And Hawthorn, look, again, I go back to sport, but Hawthorn is such a classic example. If you think about the codes that you might follow, whether it be your netball teams or basketball or rugby or football, if you were to think about the great player in the team or the number one player in the team, and the idea that that player would leave would be almost ridiculous. Hang on, how's this team going to survive with this person gone? But most experts thought when Buddy Franklin left Hawthorn that was the end of them, and it would signal the end. But the culture that had been set in place of high expectations was much bigger than the individual, and the idea that, you know what, we might have some pushback and we might have some troubles and things might change, but if this is something that's really important to us, we need to be pretty determined and adamant that we're going to stick at it and keep going. And I think that idea, the educational link, is what might be your hurdles to high expectations, and can you survive it? What support might you need to make sure that those expectations stay in place? And generally, some of the best support is in your own school. You don't have to look too far. So I wanted to try and simplify these expectations, and I'll talk through this little diagram or model that we've put together. But having high expectations of your students isn't tough stuff, and if you've invested in the relationships, it can be not that difficult. And one of the really interesting pieces of work that I've done as a principal over the last number of years has been talking to the students about what are the teachers doing in the school that you really value, and many of them talk about lots of different things that are not too shocking for us. Is that the teacher knows stuff about me, they've got a sense of humour, but one of them that stands out really that I'm hearing so much more of is that the teacher believes in me and has high expectations of me, and that's what the kids are saying. So kids feel really comfortable in that environment, probably more comfortable than sometimes we do. And so I think if that gives you confidence, the idea that kids are really accepting of this, if it's well thought out and it's really clearly explained, they will get on board. It might be a little bit challenging and there might be a couple of hurdles in the way, but they certainly will get on board. So whatever base you start from, a belief that all students can learn, they can learn well. And I think this idea around practice and pedagogy and relationships is why is this practice important, or the set of behaviours important, and how can we leverage the relationships to affect the change? And I think there's a real element of trust that sits with practice. And if we look at purpose and the why is it important that we teach, or why is it important that we reach these targets, and how do we celebrate those targets when we get to them? Because what is so incredibly important is, and we know, I'm sure all of you would know, that we get more of the behaviours that we encourage, and along the way, as we make these incremental steps along this sort of expectation continuum, that we celebrate the little things that are occurring that are great. And sometimes it can be really difficult to find those things to celebrate, but I would really encourage you to find, even if it's tiny, grab it and celebrate it, so the kids know that you're looking for the positives, and certainly you'll see more of those positives pop up if that's the type of behaviour that you're encouraging. And I suppose with persistence, when we experience hiccups, how do we ensure that we dust ourselves off with the consistent, persistent, insistent application of that expectation? And when things change, we just reset. And it's not about lowering the expectation, but we reset and we do it calmly, and we don't make rash decisions because one lesson has gone bad. We go back, we maybe need to go and see someone that is supporting us, and we say, hang on, this is what happened today, what do you reckon? And we get a little bit of support around it, but if we have to make an adjustment, we do it calmly and rationally. And I think that's a really important way to look at it. Now, I really love the analogy of the referee. Now, I remember playing sport, and I couldn't play too much basketball in the end because I constantly got myself in foul trouble. And rather than blame myself, I often like to place the blame on the referee. And the same with football. The umpire, we like to place a bit of blame on them. And the referee is such a great example of staying strong despite most people in the stadium or the football arena calling for their blood. And the great thing about referees is I wouldn't want to be a referee, quite frankly. And I know that Adam's done a little bit of umpiring in his time, and it was crushing to his self-esteem about what the types of things people said to him. But referees work off a consistent set of expectations, and they don't deviate. And I probably wouldn't say to you, use a referee as inspiration for your expectation, but I'm telling you, I think some of what they do is absolutely inspirational when it comes to expectation. If rules need to change, it's generally done in a timely and thoughtful manner. They do not do it in the middle of a game and change the rules. They go away, and when cooler heads prevail, they make some adjustments, and that's that idea of we reset, but we reset calmly. And as teachers and leaders, we often don't follow that same path. Most of the great ideas that we come up with in schools are left on the print room floor or the chopping room floor because it didn't work instantly that day or that week. And I'd like you to think about this, whether you do this while we're going through this webinar or whether you do it down the track or later on today. but I'd just be interested to know, or for you to have a bit of a think about, what are the expectations that you may have just scrapped, or programs that you scrapped, or strategies that you might have just cast aside because the day that you did it, it didn't work. And maybe now, on second thoughts, you go, hang on, I reckon this could work in a different type of environment. I'd be really interested to know what they might be, because we certainly, I've got a classic example. I was out in the Northern Territory, and it was one of the really important things with Sun Smart schools that all the kids wear hats. And I, being new at the school, decided, yep, we're all going to wear hats. And some teachers were suggesting that kids bring their own hats. I had a different opinion. I thought we would have a school hat labelled and all that sort of stuff. And some of the older kids said to me, oh, what about we just sort of bring our own hats? And I don't know what came over me that day, but someone should have clipped me over the back of the head, and I said, all right, yeah, you bring your own hats. Now, my expectation I was setting was around them all wearing hats, which was completely achievable, and I lowered my expectation, and they didn't bring their hats. So really, from my experience, we certainly have that idea that, oh yeah, you know, maybe I'll just bend this or lower my expectation, but in that situation that did not work at all. And so I think it's really important that if we're going to be flexible, we are really careful about what we're flexible about. And from my point of view, the hats sort of needed to be non-negotiable, and I negotiated, and as a result, it failed dismally, and it left me with, I had a little bit of time, or it took a bit of time to resurrect the intention of that rule or expectation, which seemed ridiculous, but in order to get it right, I had to go back to the drawing board and look at just being really determined and adamant that this rule would apply in the school. So if we value an approach and it has collective support, then we need to be far more determined and make sure it sticks. And certainly in my experience, that's exactly the way I needed to approach it. When we look at the referee, I'm yet to see too many referees change their decision. I have to talk to my son about that all the time. He has a real thing about the decisions the referees make. And I said, buddy, they will not change their decision. And I think that's important as teachers, that the kids see that we're going to be that consistency that you've talked about as being one of the great challenges, is that we are going to be consistent, and we clearly articulate that with our kids. Students appreciate consistency, and they don't generally say it, but they absolutely appreciate it. They like to know what's happening, and they like to know that there's a clear set of expectations for them every time they enter the classroom. And if that consistency is linked to high expectations, the students will get there, and it may take some time, but it's important that you're really determined to stick it at that path. And are you prepared to stay the course? I think that's a question I've often asked teachers, that if you're going to set an expectation, are you prepared to wear this out, given that there could be some pushback from both your kids and maybe from the parents? It's important to note that some of our expectations in schools don't have much flexibility. Uniform, the traditional ones, litter, fighting, and others might have more of a firm and fair feel. So does that mean that we lower our expectations? Well, I think it does. It just means that each expectation is delivered and held in a way that lines up with the school's values and your classroom values. And it's a little bit like the Goldilocks rule. We certainly want to make sure that it's not too difficult, so it's completely unattainable, and we don't want to make sure that it's too easy. We just want to try and find that right balance where I suppose where the tread hits the ground and we get some traction as well. So when we look at a little bit more into practice and this idea around pedagogy and relationship, and our method and strategies could be completely on point along with the expectations that sit alongside it. And I suppose the question we're asking is the environment conducive to kids taking risks? And we might need to be really, if we want risk-taking to occur in our class, we might have to set some really clear expectations around what that looks like when a kid answers a question, or when people put their hands up and they make a mistake. what are the structures that we're going to put in place that will absolutely expectations that allow kids to feel really comfortable in that space? And are you the type of person that kids want to take risk with or in front of, and without fear or failure? And it's really important when we're setting expectations that we foster an environment where kids feel really comfortable in that space. But I suppose how far does it go if we've not invested time in relationships? I would say to any teacher, if they'd asked advice about how they might improve things in the classroom, my first question is always, give me a 1 out of 10 when it comes to the relationships in your class at the moment. What does that look like? I think it's a really important question to ask, because much of what we want to do around expectations, we leverage off our relationships. And so I think that's the relationship component allows us to sell the idea, the strategy and the approach, and lift the expectations. And if we've invested in time, if we've invested time in the relationship, then we have a real ability to build support for change and a culture of high expectation. My accounting teacher, when I was back at high school, and I probably, if I ran into her, I'd apologise just for being me at high school. I wasn't a particularly lovely person. I hope my son is not the same to his teachers, but my accounting teacher was by no means the coolest person I've ever met, but she had really high expectations of me, and expectations that I probably didn't have of myself. But I walked into her probably early on into year 12 before my first accounting exam, and said to her, I'm out, this is too difficult. And she would not let me move. She said, no, I'll help you. Don't leave. My expectation is that you're going to finish this year and you're going to finish it well. And I'm saying, well, I don't think I've done the work. I don't think that's possible. But her narrative to me was, no, you can do it. You're going to stick at it. And because I had a pretty good relationship with her, I suppose had faith that maybe she was right, and I took that risk. And I did the exam. It was incredibly difficult, and I obviously had to burn the midnight oil studying that night and the days leading up to it. But in the end, accounting was probably one of my best subjects, because I had a great relationship with her. She had high expectations of me, maybe higher than any other teacher had of me, and got me over the line. And strangely enough, when I reflect back to this teacher, she also was the same teacher that I don't think she had any interest in sport at all, but every Monday she would ask me how football went on the weekend. And so it was something so small, but it made me feel like she was really, really interested in me. She'd invested in the relationship, and as a result, got me over the line in year 12. Now, I'm incredibly thankful for her, but I think there is a real... For me, there's an example there of, if we invest strongly in our relationships, our kids start to trust that what we're saying to them could be true, even if they might not believe it initially, that, yeah, right, maybe I can do this. Maybe this goal that my teacher set for me is absolutely attainable. And it sits really nicely within our expectations that if we've got great relationships, then we're far more likely to be successful when it comes to setting those great expectations. So we look at purpose as the next one, and I'll move to the next slide. And I suppose when we look at purpose, it's about how we communicate across the community, the why. Why are we doing something? And in my experience, it's always been best to communicate it really well in advance. Most of the time when we get pushback is because parents are not prepared for it, and the reasons why we might be doing something are not clearly communicated. And I think one of the great ideas, newsletters are one of the forms that we, for years and years and years, have used newsletters as a way of communicating with our school community, but I don't know whether we communicate much great stuff in our newsletters. Adam, I know, has spoken about the price of hot dogs being communicated in newsletters, and we don't really allow ourselves space in newsletters to show that as teachers we're the experts, and we've got some pretty important stuff to say about education and why we're doing things. So if it's expectation that might be being set right across the school, I'd encourage you to make sure that that expectation is really clearly communicated through a number of newsletters in the lead up to it. But if you're changing an approach in your classroom, in this day and age of, I suppose, you know, social media and all those bits and pieces, we've got the ability to email and communicate with our parents really quickly and let them know that this is going to be changing. And most of the time, almost all of the resistance that you might find will disappear really quickly, because generally people just want to be informed, and if they're informed, they'll wear it. And I think that helps, I suppose, when we're celebrating as well, that if it's being communicated via a newsletter or via an email or text message, that we also let our parents know, or even our students know, when we've had small wins. And we get more, as I said earlier, we get more of the behaviour that we encourage. And at times, you know, it might be hard to find the positives, but find them and celebrate the hell out of them. That would be my recommendation for you. You've got to make sure that those little small bits we recognise and we pick up on, because sometimes we miss them, but it's really important to be looking for them, because those small wins can grow into much bigger wins. And I suppose what I'd like you to think about while you're sitting there is what would be your milestones if you're thinking of a particular expectation? What would be the milestones that you'd be looking for, and how might you celebrate them? And what would be the next step? How would you build on that expectation to make sure that you keep on raising the bar for students and the expectations you have for them? And it's quite a nice segue actually, I'm talking about raising the bar, and I have a high jump bar here, and we're looking at persistence and that consistency and the standards that we put in place around expectations. And I think the idea that raising the bar is all about lifting the expectations we have of ourselves, our students, and our parents. And I think if we set standards, they hang on the idea that they are well thought out and have some significant value to the school. And that's generally why expectations stick, that they are well thought out and there is real value to the students and to the school. But what is the standard or expectation that we're going to set, and are we prepared to stay the course and be determined, even if we face opposition? And we will. There'll be some opposition from, and I think it's important that we recognise that in our planning, that if there is opposition, how are we going to deal with it? And that idea that we don't hide from opposition. If it's an expectation that we value and there's been a bit of a challenge to it, that we get on the phone, or we reset with our students and we go back over the reasons why it's been put in place. Once we set course, we then have a responsibility to apply it consistently, persistently, and insistently. And I spoke about in the October resources about the principal that I worked with, who talked very much about the expectations he'd set in the school, and there weren't a lot, but the ones that were in place, again, the word consistently, but he communicated with his community, and particularly his staff and students, in a very, very consistent, persistent and insistent way. The referee is a good example to go back to, because the referee does not flex or bend under pressure. They calmly deflect the opposition, always explaining the reason for the rule. Again, I suppose I said before that the idea that we would use a referee as inspiration for our expectations seems crazy, but it's a really powerful example, I think. And as educators, we can learn so much from this. Under pressure and when things go wrong as a profession, we can do better, I reckon. And sometimes we don't deflect and deliver our message consistently. And that idea that the statement that we keep making when it comes to our expectations is, you know what, this is the way we do things around here. And we say that consistently to our kids and to our community. Now, when we're talking about this persistence, well, if you were to think about that expectation that I referred to, that you may have in your mind at the moment, who would support you in school with the expectation that you might want to put in place in your class? And what would this support look like? Because you know, we know that people love to help and feel helpful and supportive. So there's no doubt there'll be people that can support you with this. But what would it look like, and who would be the person that would do that for you? So as we sort of get towards the end of the webinar today, I suppose this idea is the struggle worth it? And this shift in education from the blame game to creating a school culture where teachers are prepared to fail and know that there's really great support structures in place rather than what we sometimes tend to see, and that's teachers playing it safe and going back to the things that they're comfortable with or the strategies that they're comfortable with, even if they're not effective. And there's so many things that still happen in schools that I still scratch my head about because they're comfortable, but and a lot of the time they're not effective. So if we want our students to take risks, then they need to see their teachers take risks. And if you make a mistake, be human. You know, what we're trying to build in our kids is resilience, and resilience is built upon mistakes. You could be a really great example for the students that when I make a mistake, I get up, dust myself off, and I go again. So the last time I will use sport today is that there's two examples in AFL at the moment and very different approaches to the way they set their expectations. Footscray, everyone was really interested in the way that Footscray celebrated their wins, and Luke Beveridge, their coach, gave them a little bit of flexibility to go out and celebrate the wins, but making sure that they came back in a state to train on the Monday morning or the Sunday morning, whatever it might be. And on the other side, you've got a side like Hawthorn, which have some incredibly high standards, and players come and go, but there's not a lot of flexibility. You fit into our culture, and when we do things this way, and that's the only way. So it may sound a little bit corny, but my experience in an environment of well thought out, planned, and clearly communicated realistic expectations has the potential to transform the way that we teach. And our football sides are doing it in different ways, and this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to expectations. But if we develop a culture of high expectations in our classrooms, in our schools, this is not just what us as Real Schools think is important, but there's a whole lot of research that sits behind expectations and developing cultures of high expectations in our schools that really clearly point towards high-performing schools have high expectations, and when things go wrong, they stick at it even if there is a struggle. And I suppose the research that John Hattie has done, and a real wide piece of research, looks around that idea that high expectations really do transform our schools. And is the view worth it at the end? Absolutely, the view is worth it at the very end. So look, I suppose when with those high expectations, what I would encourage you to do is, if you've thought about something throughout this webinar today that maybe you've tried before or you haven't tried, but you think that it would be of real high value in your classroom or in your school, I'd encourage you to have a go at it. Make sure you follow those processes of real clear communication and that real determined, consistent, persistent approach, but stick at it and use the support structures that sit within your school already and get some success out of this. So look, I'll click through a couple of slides. And again, if there's any questions, please put your hand up on that control panel, and we'd be really happy to answer those questions. But I just wanted to point to one of the programs that Real Schools is really passionate about, and that's the Teacher Fast Track. And if you want to go a little bit further with this, the Teacher Fast Track at the moment is $475. It's a 12-month online teacher training program. There's an entry interview. The delivery of it's flexible, so you can work through the 10 modules that sit inside the Fast Track in a flexible way. There's videos, there's resources, and the great thing about the videos is that, you know, if you miss something, same with this webinar today, that you can go back go back over it, have a good look at it, and check the content again, just so that you get your understanding locked in. And the other thing is that with if you enrol in the Teacher Fast Track, you also have a life sentence with Real Schools, which means that you become a life member and you are, I suppose, able to get all those resources that are being produced on a monthly basis and all the stuff that's in archive as well. So if you're interested in that, if in the question box, if you put TFT in the question box, we can send you through a prospectus by email today. And or if you know of teachers in your school that you think that might be of benefit to, we will certainly we'll get that email out to you as soon as possible. Now the other one is that we always like to make sure that when we go through these webinars, we try and pick up topics that probably high expectations, not particularly controversial, but I think we can do it better. But one that's been really controversial, and both Adam and I have talked a little bit about, is this: if we said too much about Facebook and the idea that Facebook can be used as an amazing tool in schools, I reckon there'd be a few people in the education sphere that would run us over. But we absolutely believe that Facebook can be used for good and not evil. And the idea that this next webinar will certainly look at that. And we've seen some amazing examples when it comes to Facebook. I have a principal in Catherine who has someone on staff who goes around and takes, I suppose, real-time pictures of what's going on in the classrooms, and that's shared every day so that people in the school community can see some of the things that are happening inside the school and the types of activities. And I just reckon that's a really powerful tool and a great way for, I suppose, our school communities to better understand the great work that we're doing. We are experts in our field as teachers, and I don't think we often give ourselves credit for that. And Facebook, strangely enough, can be used as a really great tool to do that. And the other part is that if you put some really great rules and boundaries in around how people use the Facebook in the school community, most of the problems that you might think you would encounter with Facebook disappear. So I really encourage you to jump onto that one on Thursday, the 17th of November at 2017 at 3:30. I reckon that'll be a really great one, and I know that Adam's been putting a fair bit of thought into it, and we've certainly been having a bit of banter about this Facebook fear that sits out there in schools. Just lastly, I just want to obviously point you out to Real Schools and the idea that Real Schools is building, I suppose, an education community and helping develop these successful high expectations in schools through a variety of ways, through leadership, behaviour management and restorative practices. But if you've got questions or you want to know more, there's an information at realschools.com.au. Please fire away some emails and we'll get back to you straight away, and obviously you certainly can call us on 1300 789 422. And the idea around the website, again, is a really great archive of fantastic resources that you can access straight away and make some changes in your classroom or in the way that you in your teaching practice. So look, I'd really like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found it really valuable. Certainly enjoyed being with you, and have a fantastic afternoon. Thanks, everyone.